Okay, we're going to continue our conversation on integrated pest management by now looking at each of the steps in the IPM process. We've discussed the process and outlined those steps and talked about pest ecology and how populations will grow and shrink naturally as a result of predation and available resources. But let's dive into the steps in IPM, the ways humans get involved in order to handle pests from an ecological perspective. So you will recall that IPM is an ecological approach to pest management that focuses on long-term prevention and a careful selection of appropriate methods. Now let's take a look at that first step, which is the implementing of pest prevention measures. We always want to remind ourselves that prevention is the most important component of integrated pest management. You can save so much time, money, energy, and harm on the environment if we prevent the problems from happening in the first place. And there are many strategies to prevent pests from becoming a problem, but they can all be summarized with the idea that we want the strongest and healthiest plants that are appropriate for that area, because if you have strong, healthy plants, they can resist the pests and diseases on their own. If we want to divide this into further sort of categories of prevention, we can identify opportunities to prevent pests and diseases in a landscape at many points in the landscape's life cycle. And that starts right with the design of the landscape. If you have a careful design that is aware of the circumstances in that environment, the opportunities for pest invasion, we can avoid a lot of problems from the very beginning before any shovel has gone into the ground. Once a good design is created, then we want to make sure that the site is prepared correctly, that we're not bringing in soil with weed seeds, that we're not practicing poor sanitation by driving with equipment that was in another place and maybe be infecting a new site. Proper site preparation. And then the plants that are chosen, we want to choose good, strong cultivars that are resistant to pests and diseases. And the individuals themselves from the nursery, we want to verify that they're not coming in with potential pest problems. So plant selection becomes an important element to prevention. Putting the plants into the ground is an opportunity to have potential success or potential failure. And if we don't plant properly, then we will be setting our plants up to struggle throughout their life cycle. And so if we can plant properly, we give the best chance possible for a strong, healthy plant and avoid pest problems. And then finally, we want to provide appropriate care in the maintenance of the landscape. And we want to make sure we're not causing opportunities for pests and diseases to infiltrate our landscape by having poor sanitation in landscape maintenance, or by improperly treating, caring for, pruning our landscape trees and shrubs. Here's an image that sort of tries to explain the process of selecting healthy plants. And this is an agricultural setting showing a corn plant. And it's the idea that there are some cultivated varieties that may be more resistant to diseases, fungal, bacterial, viral diseases, or to pests actually consuming the plant itself. And if we select those disease-resistant varieties, we're going to have an easier time of avoiding the pests and diseases. And what this diagram is showcasing is how you don't even need to select 100% disease resistance. And actually that doesn't exist. But if we can plant a mosaic, a variety of plants, some that will be resistant mixed in with some that may be more susceptible. If we can create that mosaic, we can disrupt the spreading of the pests. And so when you have a diseased plant, for example, it will be less likely to go and become a problem throughout the entire landscape. And so just by mixing in a few here and there, you can go a long way to stopping a potential invasion from becoming a major problem. And here's a little graphic illustrating some of the best practices for installing plants properly. In particular, we're looking at our woody trees and shrubs. We want to be making sure we're planting at the proper depth, not too deep, not too shallow. We want to make sure we prepare the soil around the root ball. So we're going out to the proper width of planting and the proper depth of planting in how we dig and prepare that soil. We want to think about how we amend or do not amend the planting hole. Ultimately, when we plant our plants, we're wanting them to get established in the existing landscape. The sooner and better they can spread their roots out into the actual soil where you're placing them, the better. So sometimes some amendment in the planting hole won't help those plants seek out nutrients on the outside. Instead, we recommend typically putting mulch on top and applying nutrients and water from above over a broad area where we want to encourage the roots to grow. There are a lot of different methods for planting properly. These are just a few, but we want to make sure we follow those and set them as a standard on our landscape installations. And then finally, we want to provide appropriate cultural care. This includes the watering of the plants and not just the total volume of water, but we're looking at the timing and the frequency. That you can apply the same amount of water more often, less deep, or less often, and make it go deeper. And ideally, fewer waterings with a greater depth of water into the soil is the better outcome. Of course, everything depends on the texture of your soil, your infiltration rate, the overall weather, and the plant itself. But we're wanting to encourage those roots to go down deep so they have access to a reservoir of water, greater amounts of minerals and nutrients, and they'll be stronger, more healthy plants. Similarly, when we prune and trim our trees, we're trying to remove any dead or diseased branches, opportunities for new pests and diseases to get involved into, start consuming the trees and the shrubs. And with the pruning practices, we can either encourage or discourage the continuation of pests and diseases. Ultimately, we don't want to prune any more than is necessary, but when we do, we want to make sure we are removing potential problems and always trying to prune for a structure that's going to be strong and healthy and avoid breaks and damages into the future. So you can see that you need a bit of knowledge in landscape management if you're going to be working in IPM. Similarly, we want to practice good sanitary practices. On the maintenance side of things, that involves sanitizing our tools that come into contact with our plants. In particular, if we're going from plant to plant, there's an opportunity for you to be the vector, for you to be the thing that spreads the disease from one plant to another. And so a simple practice of sanitizing your pruners, disinfecting the equipment that touches your plants is a great habit to get into. Similarly, if you have a small nursery operation or you're reusing potting containers, that's a great environmental choice because you're not needing to purchase as much plastic, for example. However, there's the opportunity if the soil remains on the inside of the container for fungal diseases such as damping off and some of the other problems that will impact your young plants, it can remain in those pots. So getting into the habit of a diluted bleach solution or a peroxide solution on your potting material, and potentially even sterilizing the potting media itself, either with steam or with a solarization, is a great idea. Helps to minimize those potential diseases that can be spread unintentionally by reusing tools and materials. And then finally, with prevention, we'll make a mention of excluding foreign pests, because any given area where you are will have a certain number of organisms that want to find and consume your plants. However, there's also the potential for new ones to be brought in. And there is a great effort to try to restrict the movement of potential pests around the globe. It's a difficult challenge, but incredibly important. So you can see the image on the left here is showing folks at some sort of a border checkpoint or crossing. It could be interstate or it could be a national boundary, and they are inspecting plant material to verify that no pests are either intentionally or unintentionally brought in. What I mean by that is that the plants themselves are not invasive species, or they're not carrying with them any small bugs or potential bacterial or fungal infections that could become problematic. Most importantly, if they were being brought over with soil, it's actually the soil that potentially has greater chance to bring over pests and diseases that we do not want. Now you may say, is this really a problem? Is it that big of a deal? It's just nature. Shouldn't we let it go around? Well, that's one perspective. In particular, with this type of activity, we are mainly concerned with our economic crops. So yes, we are always concerned about the natural world, the environment, and not having pests and diseases that will take over wild ecosystems. But really, we're looking at the farms, the food supply of the people. If we bring in a pest unintentionally, there's an opportunity to wipe out a massive amount of the food that is necessary to keep us all alive. So it's worth the amount of money we spend to do this inspection and monitoring to try to keep everything in balance. The landscape on the horticultural side often takes a back seat to this importation of pest idea. And in fact, historically, the horticulturists have actually imported a few pests of their own, in particular invasive plants that were planted as ornamentals in the landscape and then escaped cultivation and have become problems in the wild. So with an environmental horticulture approach, we don't do that sort of a thing. We carefully select our plants. And we're also watching our local landscape species to monitor them for the importation of certain pests. One example is the date palm. Currently in San Diego, there's a new pest of date palms, and it's the red palm weevil that actually goes in and consumes and kills the palm tree from the top down. And there's no real good biological control. There's no natural predator yet. So the best strategy is to prevent this pest. So some of the classic San Diego ornamental plants, the Canary Island date palm, the grand majestic feather palm that we see out there that almost looks like a little pineapple or a firework out in the landscape, that is susceptible to the red palm weevil. Similarly, the small, what's called the pygmy date palm, Phoenix robelenii, is also potentially susceptible. Now, we don't want those things to die from the palm weevil because that's just not a nice thing, but there's an additional threat, and it is the date palm in the desert that is a thriving food source and an important commodity crop. There's a chance for those date palms to be impacted because of and in relation to our local landscape. So there's a deep connection between agriculture and horticulture in regards to pests and how hosts can develop. Now, the image on the right-hand side shows a quarantine operation. And this is a good practice to get in the habit of implementing, whether you're on a large scale or a small scale. Anytime you import new plants to a site or to a geographic area, it's a wise move to try to quarantine them. What that means is you separate them so they can't potentially impact other plants, and you watch. You monitor them to verify that there are no pests or diseases. You could even do this in your own home if you have house plants and you get one new plant, put it in a separate location where you can watch it, make sure it stays alive. But if it has spider mites or some other sort of potential problem, you don't want to introduce that to everything else in your home. So a quarantine system, as well as a rigorous monitoring and observation, is vital in the effort to exclude foreign pests. So there we go with just a little overview of that first step of IPM, preventing pest problems from happening in the first place.